one objection would say this. If Yeshua is really the Messiah, if he's so important, why doesn't the Torah speak of him at all? Oh, but it does. Now, let me turn this around and ask this. How often does the Torah speak of the traditional Jewish Messiah? How many explicit references are there to the traditional Jewish Messiah in the Torah? Well, not a whole lot unless you read certain things mystically or allegorically or with some deeper meaning. But in terms of explicit messianic prophecies, how many are found in the Torah? I could also turn around and say the foundation of traditional Judaism is Jewish tradition. The idea, and we'll come to this later on in this class, the idea that God gave an unbroken chain of oral tradition to Moses that's been passed on through the generations, and that gives the Jewish people an understanding of how to live by God's law and how to understand the scriptures. That's foundational. How many explicit references are there to that in Torah? Oh, that's another subject. So let's consider first that the Torah is not going to speak explicitly about the son of David because David comes after. David doesn't come until 1 Samuel. But the Torah can tell us a lot about the Messiah in different ways and point to him in different ways. So let's think. Number one, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. We saw in the first class how Jewish tradition put great importance on this, as if Isaac had died on the altar and his blood was shed, and as if that shedding of his blood somehow was the true expiation for Israel, and the later sacrifices just looked back to Isaac's merit by righteously laying his life down. Now, he didn't actually die, but that figure of the beloved son of the Father going to death and then coming back from death, and it happening on the third day, this prefigures the Messiah's death and coming back from death, and it prefigures the act of the Father's love, even being willing to sacrifice his own son. And there are a lot of details we could get into, messianic details and insights in the binding of Isaac. Let's consider this, just as a foretype, a foreshadowing. Joseph. Joseph is betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery in Egypt. He then becomes a leader of Egypt right under Pharaoh and becomes the savior of what? The Gentile world, while still not recognized by his Jewish brothers. Fascinating, even though they see him. And then the second time around, they recognize who he is. He reveals himself to them the second time they go to Egypt. Does that make any sense to you? Just as a foreshadowing, a prophetic prefiguring and foreshadowing. Sold into slavery, but becomes the savior of the Gentile world, revered by the Egyptians, not recognized by his own Jewish brothers until the second time, second coming, second time around. You know, there's even a Jewish joke that says when the Messiah comes, we'll ask him, is this your first time here? Or have you been here before? I've had religious Jews say, if it's Yeshua, that's fine. If it turns out that when he comes the second time, for us it's the first time, we'll embrace him. I've heard that from some religious Jews. Okay, what about the sacrificial system? Detailed in such depth in the Torah. What about the sacrificial system? Blood atonement, life for life, an innocent victim taking the place of a guilty party, blood atonement. What about the high priest who interceded for the people? And the death of the high priest brought atonement to Israel. It doesn't say it explicitly in those terms in Numbers 35, but we saw in the first class that we had, our first class in this series, how rabbinic tradition said that the death of the high priest atoned for the unintentional manslaughter, because the high priest was representative, the ideal righteous representative and intercessor of the people. That's in the Torah as well. What about this? What about the fact that Moses spoke of a prophet who would come who would be like him? According to Deuteronomy, the 18th chapter, God would raise up, he said, a prophet like me from among you. And it's written like that twice. And then it says, so you say, well, for each generation there was going to be a prophet, like Joshua would be a prophet for the next generation. That was the context of it. Well, I accept that context, except Deuteronomy 34 tells us something more. It says, and to this day, no prophet like Moses has been risen up. It uses the exact same words from Deuteronomy 18, saying, no one has fulfilled it. Yeah, you may have had your prophet in each generation like a Joshua, but there's never been another Moses. Deuteronomy said there will be. Who was that other prophet? Do you know that by the time of Jesus, the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls were looking for a messianic priest and a messianic king and a prophet as well? And they based this expectation on the prophet on Deuteronomy 18. And when Yeshua came and began to heal the sick and work miracles, people said, could this be the prophet? Could this be the prophet? And then Peter preached about it in Acts 3 and says, you got to listen to the prophet, the last great prophet, the capital P prophet, the prophet like Moses, in fact, even greater than Moses. What about this? What about this? Genesis chapter 49, verse 10. Jacob, Israel, the father of the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Israel who become the 12 tribes of Israel, prophesies on his deathbed. And he prophesies about Judah, one of his 12 sons. And he says this, that the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh. What does that mean? Until they get to Shiloh? No, that doesn't work. Until Shiloh comes. Who's Shiloh? Until Shiloh, tribute is brought to him. Until the one comes to whom tribute belongs. There's dispute about how to translate that. But it's clearly importance about leadership and rulership through Judah until a certain point. And it says, and the obedience of the nations would be his. So this is just the foretaste of the fact that the Messiah, the ruler, the one to whom the obedience of the nations would be, would come through Judah. And of course, David is of the line of Judah. These are just some of the reflections about Messiah being prefigured in Torah, and they work wonderfully well in terms of Jesus, Yeshua, and they don't work wonderfully well in terms of other potential candidates or even traditional Jewish understandings of Messiah. What about Genesis 3:15? Is that messianic, speaking of the triumph of the seed of the woman over the seed of the serpent? Is that ultimately speaking of the triumph of a human being over the kingdom of Satan? It could be in a veiled way, in which case it works well, prophesying of Yeshua, but I would never be dogmatic about that.